Today's participants are Terri Fine, and Peter Delfyett. We join their conversation in the faculty lounge.
Big rocks that were pushed down from the glaciers, and they go under this roadway and they come out on the other side of this lake, and they're back in prehistoric times, and they had all these dinosaurs, and I was just so enamored about dinosaurs and everything, and it just got me excited about science, and at that age I wanted to become a paleontologist, at the ripe young age of 8 years old. But then as I went through school, I always did well in math and science. Again, science lab was like playing games, and I remember in the 7th grade dissecting a frog and running around the room chasing the girls with the frog, the standard stuff guys do. But ultimately, when I got to college, I had gone to school for electrical engineering, and I was thumbing through the course catalog, and I saw one of the courses which said, lasers, and one of the applications was fiber optics. This was about maybe in 1978, let's say. And I said, wow, fiber optics is going to be the technology of the future. This is something I'd really like to get into. And that's what I did. It's
okay,
very,
because
very exciting.
I saw from your write-up that you are also interested in mentoring younger people for science.
That's right.
So are you concerned about what many people talk about in terms of science and technology expertise coming more from overseas than in the United States? Does that concern you at all?
Yeah, this is an important issue. There's a recent report put out by the National Academy of Science. I think it's called The Gathering of the Rising Storm. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure if I got the title correct, but it does suggest that the U.S. is in a difficult position with respect to the fact that youth are not going into the areas of science and math. Mm-hmm. And as we go forward in the 21st century here, our whole economy is becoming more technologically based. And if you're relying on knowledge which is going to be imported, it has the potential that you can also lose that knowledge because people will come here, get trained, and go back to their home countries. They're getting stronger economically, and we just won't be able to be competitive in the way that we would like to be. So that is a problem.
Now, in your experience, do people typically get interested in science at the age that you did, or more in college, or when do those kinds of sparks happen?
That is a great question. It turns out that middle school is a critical area, mm-hmm. and that either, if you're not going to be turned off by it, you'll at least be able to recognize that science and math are important. But many times, for folks which are in middle school, you're growing older, you're discovering the opposite sex, etc. And let's face it, I think it's sort of not cool mm-hmm. to be a nerd, or it's not cool to do well in math and science. And, mm-hmm. and so at that age, all kids are just trying to be cool. And so as a result, even though they may have some potential, they may not really want to push it. And that's when I think is a critical time. And so if students can kind of get over that stigma of being cool or being a nerd, whatever it is, and are managed to navigate their way through that, then they'll do fine in college. Mm-hmm. And that was something that I had to grapple with when I was in junior high school, for sure. I was definitely a nerd.
Oh, absolutely. I've read interviews with you mm-hmm. that have used that 4-letter word.
Right.
The process of that. One of the issues that I think we're both interested in, based on your resume, based on my resume, is sort of looking at underrepresented groups in various professions and in various career opportunities. How much do you see yourself as a role model to other underrepresented groups
right.
in science?
I do view myself as a role model mm-hmm. because, again, coming up as a youth, many times you may not have other people that you can look towards as mm-hmm. a mentor or a role model to be able to say to yourself, well, gee, I look like him, or I come from the same community or neighborhood, mm-hmm. and as a result, you just don't even think about the prospect that you could become a scientist.
Yes.
A scientist. This was something that was just so far out in terms of what a possible career could be, mm-hmm. and so as a result, I do like to go out into the community and give lectures to whether it's the Boy Scouts or go to Hungerford Elementary, mm-hmm. And to interact with the students, et cetera, to kind of excite them, to let them see, hey, it is in fact possible to become an engineer or a scientist. And in fact, the money's pretty good. That's what I always tell them. I always try to relate to them in terms of something that they can relate to, because the first thing they're going to ask you is, what kind of car do you drive? How much money do you make? And if you can relate to them on that level in terms of things that they think which are important at that time, they'll be okay.
Right. Yeah, I know that there's this notion about sort of what's legitimate in terms of what you might do, what a person might do professionally, and how do you relate that. I know, for example, in terms of my interest in women's studies, that being female doesn't make me an expert in women's studies. I don't know any more about women's studies than anybody else who also took nothing in women's studies. And when I was going through college, which was in the 80s, I had this experience of being at schools that never offered anything in women's studies. And then when I was in graduate school, and I don't know anybody who went through graduate school who wasn't poor. I mean, we have to go through that. And somebody offered me to teach a class on women in politics because they thought that it would bring women to campus for one of these satellite schools of the University of Connecticut where I was. And I thought, how could I teach a course on women in politics? I never took a course on women in politics. And wouldn't you know, I was in the political science department, and I said, has anybody in this department ever taught women in politics? No, we think at UMass Amherst, there maybe was somebody up there you could get a syllabus from. So I think that there's a lot to be said for sort of recognizing either gaps in who the professionals are or what the profession is doing in terms of talking about underrepresentation, and then sort of trying to make it mainstream and legitimate. And I think that that has been a great opportunity for me as well, is to see a gap and then to try to address that gap in terms of trying to develop and not only offer more courses in women in politics, but also to recognize that in terms of who has power, the people who have power are the people who wrote the rules about who should have power. And it has excluded those persons who they consider to be not credible for hundreds of years. And there's a lot to be said for trying to create an appreciation for my students for not only role models in my profession, but role models in government as well.
Interesting. Yeah, it's kind of amazing where you'll say, I guess in your particular case, I say, oh, well, gee, Terry's a woman, so therefore she can teach this class.
Because she knows.
Because she knows, she must know.
Yeah.
It's like you're born with this knowledge or something like that.
Right, and I think it's one thing that's very different between political science and your field, optics, is that people don't think because they can see that they know optics. But people, because they might be interested in politics, think they understand government.
Yeah, that's true. It's amazing when you say people think they know about a particular discipline or not, and sometimes they're just so far off. I remember one time, I told someone I was an optical engineer or something, and the first thing they wanted to do was fiddle with their glasses. Gee, well, my prescription is a little off. You think you can help me? And I said, no, we don't. That's not exactly what we do. Or the other interesting time was, again, I was an undergraduate, doing electrical engineering, and I was going into Manhattan. I was on the subway, and I ran into someone that I knew, and they said, oh, you're in school? I said, yes. And they said, what are you going to school for? So I said, oh, I'm going to school to become an engineer. And they said, great, how long does that take? So I said, 4 years for sure. And they kind of looked at me strange and said, gee, I didn't know it took that long to learn how to drive a train. And then they were serious. And I said, no, that's not exactly what it is.
But wouldn't it be better if it took people that long to learn how to drive a train? We'd have fewer accidents, maybe. I don't know.
Perhaps, absolutely.
So have you seen yourself, one of the things you said that when you were taking that first course in fiber optics, that it was new to the curriculum. How do you see what have you done at UCF in terms of broadening the curriculum in the field? If this is a relatively new field.
Right. As a faculty at Creole, what we do is we try to train students to get their master's and PhDs in the area of what we'll call optical science and engineering. Optical science and engineering is in some sense somewhat like physics, or in some way like electrical engineering, but it's basically the study and the use of light for technology. In the same way that electronics is an outcome of the study of electricity, photonics is the outcome of the use of light for making things like your compact disc player, fiber optics, infrared viewing systems, a variety of technologies, your liquid crystal display. And so faculty, what we do is We come into Creel and we develop courses. There's a standard kind of core technology, kind of like the fundamental concepts that a political scientist would want their students to know. There are these core courses,
Right.
and then there are the specialties. And in the same way you might design a course which is focused on your research or specialty, faculty then develop or design courses on their research specialty. And in that way they're able to incorporate or bring the newest discoveries and technologies into the classroom. And so this way you're able to really bring the current state of the art into the student's mind, as soon as possible.
Now you had mentioned, sorry to interrupt,
That's
but you
okay.
had mentioned something called liquid crystal display. Now what is that?
A liquid crystal display liquid crystal is a goop. It looks goopy. It's very viscous, and it turns out it's a molecule that if you were to apply, if you put this goopy liquid in between a couple of like glass plates with some electrodes on it, and you pass a little current through it, it's really a voltage, that you could get this molecule to align itself, and then as light passes through it, you could change the brightness of the light or change the color of the light, especially if you illuminated it with white light. And so this liquid crystal display is the kind of stuff that people have their computer displays made of, or these big TV screens that they have now in your Walmart or the department store, whatever it is. And liquid crystal displays are in fact a very, very interesting and unique technology. And that's a new kind of course area that we recently brought into UCF and Creel. We brought in a faculty, Professor S.T. Wu from Hughes Research Laboratories, and he's kind of leading that area at Creel.
Okay, well that's an interesting question. You're talking about Professor Wu, and then you sort of jokingly mentioned Walmart. You've had a career in private industry, and then you came into academia, and you're talking about somebody else who has. How does that work? I mean, how does somebody decide to leave behind private industry and then come into the world of tenure and promotion and deans and provosts and all kinds of things?
I think for many people which have had an opportunity to work in industry, many of us have always, or certainly for me, I'll speak for myself, I always knew in the back of my mind that one day I'd be a professor. Okay. Just because, I like interacting with students. I like the youthful energy. I like the ability to always look under every rock to try to discover something new. Whereas, and it's so much freer in academia with respect to the research areas that you can pursue. Again, you're allowed to pursue any area of research. With a caveat, as long as you're getting funding to do it, it makes it easy. Whereas in private industry, it's much more focused on the vision and goals of the company. And over the last, I'll say, 15, maybe 20 years, industry-based research has becoming even more focused, where the timeline or horizon in terms of an industry's investment in research, they basically want to invest some money and say, okay, is the product out in 3 months? How are we going to get a return on our investment? Whereas, many years ago, 30, 40 years ago, the concept of doing research, the timeline might have been 5, 10, 20 years. Even some aspects where you might have been doing research in an area and you absolutely had no idea where it would take you. But it was just the idea that we need to be there looking and learning because we don't know what's going to be under that rock.
Right. Yeah. So there are certain, it's not that it's something that people actually choose to do, because people, I think especially in my students' case, when I try to talk to them about being a professor, I say, once you have tenure, you have job security, you can pursue these interesting questions, people think you're smart. Right. I mean, there's a glut of lawyers in Florida, why bother, et cetera. And they have this vision that, that working for yourself or working in private industry is so far superior. And yet in reality, there are so many things that we can do here as professors that you just can't do out there.
That's right. You mentioned this concept of working for yourself. To tell you the truth, I actually think that when you are a professor, you in some sense really are working for yourself. And that's what I like. Again, in industry, it's a little bit more narrower, tighter focus. You do have that freedom in academia. You do feel like you're working for yourself. And the concept of having tenure is really great. When I was in industry, I worked very hard. There was a period of my industrial career where I worked 13 hours a day. And I'd show up at 6:30 in the morning, work till 7:30 at night, and I could feel the stress because it was a very competitive laboratory. You know, now in academia, I still work hard, but the risks that I take with my research, I think I'm much more riskier, and I don't mean it to say that you're wild with respect to doing research. No, it just means that, you know, in industry, you know, you're going to be evaluated on what you're able to produce, and so there's something what we call high risk, high payoff. And so it could be extremely risky, but if you make it work, you're going to be a hero.
Yeah.
But if you don't make it work at the end of the year, you've got nothing to show. Oh, that's not good for your performance review.
Right.
So in industry, that's you're taking a chance if you do high risk, high payoff. In academia, the high risk, high payoff is just where I want to live all the time, because if I miss it, that's okay. You're not going to lose your job. You have next year to work on it, refine it, and keep going at it. And so this idea of having some sort of sense of job security really allows me to feel comfortable to take, you know, much greater chances in terms of what I'm doing. It really allows you to push the envelope. It really does. And it's another expression I have that if I'm getting it right all the time, I'm not trying hard enough. That, you know, I really have to try a lot of different things, because, you know, we're going to really try and push the envelope, and you can't get it right all the time, because you really don't have the knowledge to know it all the time.
That's absolutely true, that there's so many, you know, a person like me, if I might want to be working on one or two projects at once, or multiple projects at once in different stages, and there's a real luxury there, and there's something to be said about, especially to have enthusiasm about your field. You have enthusiasm about your field, I have enthusiasm about mine, you're helping me become enthused about your field by this conversation. But there's just so much to be said for that, to think, well, I'm really interested in this question, or this approach to this question, or the fact that, you know, when I was in graduate school, I remember this teacher I had, and on the one hand she was right, and on the one hand she was wrong, and I tried to sort of say, she would always say, she only had to say it once, I should say, actually. She said, you know, when you're thinking about a research question, and she put it as in terms of food, which that's maybe why I remember it, but if you're thinking about a research question, if you're thinking about, you know, you like peanut butter on your celery, and your peanut butter on your apples, and you put peanut butter on your green pepper, and nobody you know has ever put peanut butter on a green pepper, it probably means they tried it and failed. And to me, that was good advice and that was bad advice. It was good advice to say, okay, I'm not going to come up with this brilliant idea and it'll go nowhere, because other people, I mean, political science has been a profession. The association has been around for just over 100 years. Aristotle was 2,500 years ago, so we have all this history of saying, well, these were great minds, and if they didn't come up with it yet, it's not worth coming up with. But that's really not true.
It's really not true.
That is truly not true. And that's what academia gives you the freedom to do, is to try to sort of find those pockets where somebody might have said, well, this is just a terrible idea. And then maybe it's really important to find out, well, what would make that person think that this was a terrible idea? What was going on? What was going on culturally or socially at the time that where there were people saying, well, you can't let women have any power. And they would, and depending on whether or not you're talking about 16th or 17th century philosophy, and they're using, I mean, science is such a legitimate thing. They were using science and saying, well, Montesquieu, so, you know, famous political philosopher, is also obviously gone from the 17th century, who said, well, you know, women, you know, men's emotions are in their head and women's emotions are in their uterus. And so as long as you have a uterus, you're too emotional for politics. And wouldn't you know, look what happened, especially in the 1992 election, where Bill Clinton, because he had a soft side, that got him a job, that got him a job because he showed he had a soft side. And they said all these women voted for him because they had a soft side. And then sort of times have changed that said, what was the legitimacy of saying that having emotion, and now this scientific argument, of course, has no legitimacy, but using science to say, well, women are too emotional, and therefore we have to make sure that that government is rational, and the two can never meet. And so it's really very interesting for me to sort of, tell my students about that class where the green pepper with the peanut butter.
Right.
There's some truth to it,
Right.
but maybe there's a way to look at a question in a way that the literature would support,
Right.
instead of saying, well, if it hasn't been done, it's just simply not worth doing.
I've had similar experiences. I think the thing I'd like to say about that is when I was coming up, I can recall being an undergraduate and having an idea. And inevitably, I would kind of run to one of my professors and said, "Oh, wow, I've got a great idea." And I would try and explain, and he said, "Oh, yeah, very nice. That was done, so many years ago. Please check this paper." And that was sort of, I'd feel a little disappointed. But then after a while, I said to myself, well, at least my thought process is correct.
Okay.
And so at least I'm on the right track. I
Yeah.
may not have had the big discovery today, but at least someone else great has thought about it, and it worked, and so my thought process is good. So that's one aspect. There was another aspect when you say people have tried and it didn't work. I recall one time, of course is a true story. I was a relatively new faculty at UCF, and I flew to Washington with an idea. And I was going to present this to a gentleman within the Department of Defense. And it was a laser technology that was going to be useful for fiber optic communication. And I opened my little folder of view graphs, and it's out looking at him, and it's, I'm like a proud father. Boom, my first view graph. And he looks and says, "It won't work." And I'm like, oh my gosh. And I said, but wait, you just have to listen. And I go to my second view graph, and he says, "It won't work." And I'm there for a half an hour, view graph after view graph, and he's saying, "It won't work, it won't work, it won't work." I felt so discouraged. And so obviously the plane ride back to Orlando was a long one. Even though it's 2 hours, it was a long one. But the thing was that I had enough confidence in myself that I thought something was there. And I worked hard. I got this thing to work, and I was giving an invited talk in Japan. And one of this defense contractor's colleagues happened to be in the audience, and he saw me and he said, "Oh, gee, Peter, that is absolutely fantastic. Does Bob know about this?" And so I said, "Absolutely. He says it won't work." And so within 2 weeks, I got a call, to come and give another briefing, and then I've been on the funding. Then I've been able to garner funding from that organization ever since.
How about that?
Yeah, it's very good. That's a great success story.
Yeah, and I've had an idea for I think this idea I've had for probably 20 years.
Yeah.
And it's one of those, it's not that it won't work, but is it really worth doing?
Yeah.
One of my concerns about our society today is low voter turnout.
Yeah.
I'm concerned about the low voter turnout in terms of the percentage of people who vote, but also the quality of information that they have.
Right.
And there are so many people who say, well, it's too hard to vote, it's too hard to get information, or what have you. And there's one population, when I was in 1981, when I was an undergraduate, I think it was urban politics class, the professor had us read a book called The Gift Relationship. Mm-hmm. And it was about blood donation. Mm-hmm. It was about sort of the politics of the Red Cross or something. And I thought, isn't this interesting that people give blood knowing that their one pint isn't going to save a life. And they're willing to take the time out of their day, go have a needle stuck in their arm. Right. And obviously they have a strong sense of connection to their art or community, a strong sense of civic duty. And there's all this there was this big study in the 60s. And one of the findings, it's one of the books that everybody has to read, mm-hmm. and then maybe you don't know why till later,
right.
but everybody has one of the great books.
Right.
And that's what it said, that when you consider, family connections or family political background, a commitment to a party, commitment to a candidate, that the one factor that will drive somebody to vote more than those other three is a sense of civic engagement, right. civic mm-hmm. duty. Right. I said, well, that's why people get blood. Right. Maybe if we studied blood donors and why they do what they do, we could get people
to vote.
Right.
It's
still one of those.
No, that's actually good. That's good. I like
yeah, I mean,
that.
it's just one of those ideas that it just hasn't been pursued, but it's just this idea about, and part of it's, like, but the blood donor population is so small, they probably already vote anyway. So the idea about trying to find out what motivates them to have this sense about being part of a larger whole,
Right.
that if a vote's not going to decide an election, a pint's not going to save a life, you still have to go through this process of waiting, and it's
Right.
uncomfortable.
Right.
Either there's a line, or you have to find the polling place, you have to have
Yeah.
your needle stuck in your arm. But there are these populations out there that are so motivated and so connected to their community. And there's this political science research that said that more so than being devoted to a candidate is your sense that you're part of this system.
Right. Yeah, I find sometimes people, with respect to voting, that either people really have this tremendous sense of community loyalty and this desire to be, a participant in the process, but then there are other folks which just seem to have, I don't want to. I'm going to call it an unhealthy skepticism, because
Yes.
the unhealthy part is that they just decide not to participate, and that, I think, is not proper. I mean, to borrow a phrase from the lottery, you've got to be in it in order to win it.
That's right.
So you really have to participate in your community. If you really want the community to change, you really have to.
Absolutely. And even if you want the community to stay where it is, you're losing your voice
Yeah.
if you don't participate. And I think that that's particularly when we look at younger people.
Yeah.
I mean, it's interesting that younger people have the lowest voter turnout of any group. Even people over 80
Right.
vote more than people 18 to 21.
Right.
And it's to me, it's just very troubling.
Right.
And yet in other countries, turnout is an 80, 90, 95%. In Australia, Italy has the highest voter turnout in the world. And Australia is the only democracy in the world that requires that you vote. And Italy is higher than Australia.
Wow.
Okay? Because there's something...